Hello, my friends. If you're watching this, then my guess is that you may be someone who knows or is in a relationship of some kind with someone who has some sort of brain dysfunction. And when I say that, I mean things like particularly invisible things like anxiety, depression, and eating disorder, Asperger's, PTSD, things of that nature. And the reason I'm making this is because, well, this one foundational principle that all each of us has is our own personal experience. That's all we've got to go on. We really can't. That's how we're designed. And it's pretty obvious when you grow up, when you have friends, that everyone is so surprised to find out that other people's families do things so differently, or, oh wow, like that person grew up this way. And it's the same thing when it comes to brain dysfunction, but one of the things that can happen is that when you have never had brain dysfunction and someone that you know does, it's understandably it's impossible for each person. Like if a person has had some sort of dysfunction their whole life, they can't understand what it's like to never have had that. And if you've never had that, you can't understand what it's like to have that. And part of the reason I'm making this is because a lot of these types of things that are very real dysfunctions that occur in the brain look like a person's just being lazy, irresponsible, rude, selfish, and a lot of other things that are really negative, when in fact there's some serious actual dysfunction happening. And it can be very challenging and difficult to handle a person who is having some sort of brain dysfunction happening. So I'm offering this as just a brief explanation of what's actually happening in the brain of someone who has some sort of dysfunction going on, when it's full blown, and what that looks like and why it happens. Brief, and then a brief explanation of what recovery is about, and kind of just the same thing, getting inside the mind of recovery as well. So I'm going to start with, and this is, I'm a kind of I had dysfunction my entire life. I don't have a diagnosis, but I have learned through the process of recovering from limbic system impairment that I was never normal, I was never neurotypical, and I had no idea what being a normal person was like. As I've gained that function, I look back and I'm like, wow, I had no idea this is normal. Like, I now understand. It makes it obvious. Like, this is how the rest of the world operates. I just had no idea because I'd never experienced it before. So one of I think just a run-of-the-mill anxiety, or run-of-the-mill example I'm going to give is anxiety or depression. So anytime someone has something like that going on, they've been through some experience of trauma. And I'm going to give a really simple definition of trauma because it's a word thrown around a lot. It's any experience a person goes through that overwhelms their brain's ability to cope with it and to process or understand what happened. And as you can understand, I mean, look around at the world. We live in a world where there's a lot of bad things that happen, and it's pretty easy for that to occur to anyone. And a lot of, if not most, people have experienced trauma in their lives. It affects people differently. So some people are more affected by it than others for a variety of reasons. But once a person's gone through that, the self-preservation instinct, the limbic system, which is your survival mechanism, kicks in, and it kind of hijacks your brain and starts to run the show because it's trying to protect you from having that ever happen again. Because you can't understand what happened, and you're just this very reptilian survival instinct is like, oh, we got to make sure this doesn't happen again. So it goes on hypervigilant alert. It tends to replay negative scenarios a lot because it thinks, okay, if we just know where the threat is at and we think about it a lot, then we can make sure it doesn't happen again. With all of that going, with all of this hypervigilance and constant scanning of the environment and fear, that person's living in a place where their brain has been hijacked by this like super alert scanner, and it's like just looking for possible threats in the environment. And there's 4 different responses. There's flight, running away from things, and that's anxiety more so. Freeze, which is more depression or down. Chronic fatigue syndrome, things like that. There's a lot of different things in that category. Fight. So people who have rage issues and have had that for a long time, or just get very, very angry for no apparent reason about little things. Just fly off the handle of little things. That's the fight response. Just massive irritability. And then the last one is the fawn response, FAWN, which is codependency. So if that person went through a situation where they were in some sort of environment where it was dangerous for them to assert themselves because someone else in the environment was unstable, and they felt like their life was threatened if they were to upset the status quo, then they lose their sense of self essentially and become like a people pleasing robot because that's what keeps you physically safe in an environment. And again, say that could even be like a work environment because your job is your livelihood, right? So financially, like you can still the same thing can happen in an adult environment as much as a childhood environment. So those are the types of things that happen. And again, so it's just been interesting because I've seen a lot of people who have never had this experience look at me, look at other people with these things, and be like, they just need to get their shit together. They're just lazy. They're just not trying. And what actually is going on inside of that person at that time is when you have that hijacking your mind and you're in it, you can't tell. You don't know that that's happened. So you're having all of these racing thoughts. You're having possibly physical symptoms of anxiety. Maybe you're depressed. You wake up one day, you just can't move. I started having clinical depression when I was 13, and I could barely get myself to move through the day for school. I would just sit in the car and stare at the house for an hour when we got home and just couldn't move. Just nothing, like no ability to override it. I didn't know what was happening. You don't know what's happening when you're in there. And also because so much energy is put towards self-preservation and scanning and all these different protective mechanisms, trying to accomplish tasks is very difficult. It takes, and I realize this only again in retrospect, but I realize now after recovery, something like making dinner, for example, like cooking a meal or completing a task, like doing some laundry or cleaning the house or whatever, like something like that, when my brain is in a good space, is easy and even enjoyable, and it takes about the same amount of effort as, I don't know, walking a quarter a mile or a half a mile. When my brain was in a rut all the time, something like cooking dinner took about the equivalent of running about 8 miles. Like that's how much effort it took for me to make dinner, and it would take an insanely long amount of time for me to accomplish anything. Because when your brain, your survival brain has hijacked your function, you don't have access to the higher parts of your brain that help you like make sense of your environment, your sensory input, being able to like follow through logically a number of steps or make sense of things. And there's this, it's like walking through sludge. It's exhausting. And that's another thing that a lot of times happens is people like us who have that dysfunction happening often appear to be very unintelligent because our higher functioning brain is not on, and it's because that survival brain has hijacked it. So that was something that is interesting because I went my whole life having some people tell me I was very intelligent and other people tell me I was very dumb. And at the end of the day, walking through the whole process of recovery, I was like, well, that part of my brain was really dumb. That's just your survival instinct. It's not very intelligent. And when that was running me, yeah, I wasn't very intelligent, but it wasn't really me. I just didn't have, I wasn't able to access that part of my brain when it was completely hijacked by the survival instinct. So the other thing, too, that can happen a lot and be frustrating for someone who doesn't experience any sort of dysfunction like this, but is living with someone who does, is the lack of boundaries is a common part of this. And that's also because if you've grown up, and this again, whether the person has grown up with it or whether it's something that happened later in life, either you don't have a chance to develop your sense of self or you lose your sense of self. Because when you're living inside of that trauma response, it's like your whole life is run by it. It's the only thing you see inside your own head when you look around is all the fear and all the looping and all the like, well, how am I going to cope with today? There's no ability to like think about other people when you're in a survival response. You're just trying to survive. So people tend to be very inconsiderate and not understand social norms. That was one thing too. I realized like I didn't understand what boundaries were until I started rewiring, and I couldn't understand why other people thought my behavior was inappropriate because I was literally just trying to survive. And there was like that higher, the neocortex, I know for myself personally, because I never had healthy brain function, it just hadn't developed at all. Like the neocortex is the exterior part of your brain, and it's what governs like social interaction. And mine had literally never developed because I'd always had dysfunction. And in retrospect, it's like, wow, that's a big deal. So just so you understand, again, that's where that person's brain is at, and when it's running them, it's very difficult to live with. But I can tell you that they're not doing it on purpose. That really is just what happens when the brain is completely focused on your own survival. So yeah, and a lot of times people seem very lazy because when that's completely overwhelmed you, you lose all sense of purpose. Your life doesn't appear to have any meaning. There's not really any energy left over. And this is the interesting thing too, because a lot of times people who experience and live with this kind of brain dysfunction when it's running their lives, they don't have a lot of energy for things, but they also don't do very much. And that's the part that can seem confusing. It's like, how could you be tired when you haven't done anything all day? And that's the thing. So when that limbic system, when your protective mechanism's activated in a high alert for threats all day long, and it has all this adrenaline pumping through your system, it's like you're running from a tiger all day, even though you're not. But your body is experiencing that, and there is so much energy used up and expended, and it's like your body's pushing you so hard against your will, even if you're doing nothing. And again, that was a very interesting thing to experience. Once it stopped, I was like, wow, it's like I wasn't even pushing myself, but there was like pedal to the metal level of adrenaline pretty much my entire life. Even though I wasn't doing much with it, I was just trying to cope with what was happening inside of my brain and body. It is exhausting to deal with. So that's part of the laziness, is like so much energy is spent just trying to cope with what's happening inside of you that you don't do anything else. And it's almost impossible to do anything else sometimes. So that's what's actually happening. In terms of recovery, if you are living with or love someone who is working on recovering, one of the things, again, to realize is because this is the brain, that a lot of things that would make sense and that would work for you won't work for the person that you love. Because if you have that healthy brain function, a lot of times solutions to these things, like if you're having a bad day, or another thing that can happen in this sort of thing is that a lot of times people with these issues, their relationship to food and movement becomes very skewed. I had a eating disorder my whole life that I didn't realize until after I'd healed it. Part of the problem was that my body had never learned how to digest most macronutrients, but especially carbohydrates. So I was a very picky eater, and underate and overate, and had all kind of eating disorder issues my whole life. But it was like I'd had it since I was born. I had those issues since I was born, and it was like, wow, okay, so this wasn't it wasn't a willpower issue, it wasn't a nutrition issue, it was entirely my brain. And that was a really interesting to observe after it had ended. But a lot of things like simple fixes that would work for someone who doesn't have a full-fledged limbic system impairment, or they don't have trauma running their brain 24/7, aren't going to work for someone who does have that happening. And that's one thing I see common, is it's a frustration of like, why can't you just do this, and why won't you do that, and why isn't this work for you? And the person being like, oh well, that doesn't work for me, this doesn't work for me, that doesn't work for me. They're not trying to be difficult. It really doesn't work for them, because when you have that level of brain dysfunction, those simple things that work for most people who don't have that kind of dysfunction aren't going to work for them. So in that vein, going through something, and so if this person is in any sort of recovery program, whether it's something like AA, whether it's a program like DNRS or Gupta or anything like that, it's a process, and it's an uncomfortable process for the person in it. It's an uncomfortable process for you if you live with that person or you see them regularly. When a person's in recovery, and understand too that like when you start recovery, it takes time for the person who's doing that to learn how to do the process. And that's something, as a coach, I always tell people, like, be patient with yourself, because you're trying to learn how to heal your brain using your brain, and your brain's not working very well. So it can take a while to actually get the hang of it, because you're trying to use the thing that's broken to fix the thing that's broken. So it takes a while for people to get momentum for that reason. So if it seems like the person that you love is struggling a lot, just be patient with them as much as you can, and encourage them as much as you can, and know that that's normal. It doesn't mean they're failing. It doesn't mean they're doing something wrong. That's just part of the process. The other thing that's important to understand, and I know my husband got frustrated with this when he was watching me, was there is a circular nature to recovery. So how that person behaves when they're really in their dysfunction, a lot of times things get worse before they get better. When you start to change the brain, it resists because it's afraid of change. It thinks it's trying to protect that person and keep them alive, so it will fight tooth and nail the change that they're trying to do. So a lot of times they'll make they'll say they're making progress, and then they'll end up with kind of back in the same behaviors later on. And one of the things that's happening is that they'll work through a layer. So maybe that person, started out when they were trying to train on movement, like walking or eating certain foods, or going to the grocery store, and they worked through that. But then maybe they're struggling again, and it's 6 months or a year down the road, and at that point what they're working on is the codependency with other people, or a victim mindset, or deeper held core beliefs about themselves, and lack of self-love and self-sabotage and sort of things that are much deeper level, and it still looks the same on the outside. They may still have the same struggles and the same behaviors happening on the outside. They're working through a different layer though. So it can look like someone's not making progress because they keep coming back to the same patterns of behavior. And it looks like, oh, you're not making progress, but they're really just working, because there can be a lot of layers if you've had dysfunction for a long time. There can be a lot of layers to it. So yeah, and it can take time. Recovery takes time, but it's one of those things where if you work with computers or machinery of any kind or anything like that, any kind of infrastructure, because that's, I think, sort of similar to the brain. Then you can understand the importance of going and fixing the actual problem, and not just trying to slap, especially if it's like, an electrical grid for an entire part of a city or something dangerous or big scheme, where if you don't do it right the first time, because it takes a long time and it's inconvenient to hunt down the problem and actually do it right the first time, then the whole thing's just going to crash again later on and possibly create a worse problem, or someone might get hurt in the process or so forth. Healing the brain is the same way, where it requires an incredible amount of patience to find the actual issues and work through the actual issues and not get sidetracked by wishing that there was some shiny solution that didn't require so much effort and time. So again, if the person that you love is taking a long time to recover, that would be why. It does take a long time to heal these things, and you've got to get to the root and heal that. So that explanation. And then the last thing I want to say is just on behalf of everyone who has limbic system impairment or any sort of brain dysfunction, thank you. If you have provided someone that you love with a listening ear, with encouragement, with financial support, with a place to live, with, biting your tongue, any of the things, picking up the extra slack for that person while they recover, thank you. It's a very difficult situation for both parties to be in, both the person recovering and the person who is not experiencing dysfunction, who's left with more work to do, and this confusing experience of being around someone who's either in dysfunction or recovery. They're both so difficult. I think they're equally difficult in different ways. So take care of yourself, be gentle with yourself, have compassion for yourself as you go through this journey of being around someone who's recovering. And yeah, just as much as you can, give them the space they need to recover. But thank you for everything you offer to those people, because we know, I've been in the place where I've wanted to say thank you to the people in my life, but I was already experiencing so much shame and guilt over being ill in the first place that I couldn't get thank you out of my mouth. So it's a difficult place to be in, and I know for me, again, I think this probably rings true for a lot of people, one of the hardest parts of recovering was the fact that I had to let go of some of those responsibilities and not be able to be there for people I loved, or not be able to do the work that I wanted to do and contribute to my family or my work as much as I wanted to, because I knew I had to take care of the issue at hand first in order for it to be sustainable. Because if you don't do it right, it doesn't work. And when you do that enough times, you realize, okay, I got to do this right. But it is oftentimes those of us in recovery wish more than anything that we could be offering more to you and to the families and friends and everyone in our community. So we're grateful for your patience with us as we walk this journey of recovery. So thank you.